Hey guys, it's John, and welcome to another game analysis from the UT Dallas Fall FIDE Open. This is my round 5 game I'm about to show you. And before I start, I just wanted to thank everyone for the awesome feedback and comments I've been getting over the past few days. I've been posting several of these vlogs now, and they just got a tremendous response. And I wanted to thank you guys because it's hard to thank everyone individually, but really appreciate the support from Team Scandi. You guys are always there for me, so thanks a lot. So in this round, I was playing National Master Chris Toolin, and his FIDE rating is 2202. I actually know this player. We went to college together. I think he's a year older than me. And I knew this was not going to be an easy game. I'll tell you that right away, because he had been having a fantastic tournament, and still is having a fantastic tournament. And he had beaten some 2400 players, a pair of 2400 players, I believe, and we had the same score, so 2 out of 4 going into this round. So I was black in this game, and Chris opened with d4. I played knight f6. He played c4. And I played c5. He played d5. And now I played b5, which is the Benko Gambit. Now, my choice of opening in this game was motivated by the knowledge that Chris was not a native d4 player. From the games I had seen in the database, he mainly opened e4, and I just had the impression that he hadn't played d4 for very long and was kind of transitioning that move into his repertoire with the white pieces. So when you notice something like that, that definitely affects how you might play against that person. And I was trying to put myself in his shoes. If I were a d4 player just getting my feet wet in the queen's pawn openings, what sort of lines would make me feel uncomfortable? And I usually play d4, d5, and I don't mind going into like a semi-Slav or Slav or whatnot, sometimes even a Queen's Gambit decline. But those are a little bit more sedate lines, whereas lines like the Benko Gambit or even something as crazy as like the Budapest Gambit, the Grunfeld, the King's Indian, more unbalanced responses to d4 would probably upset a fledgling d4 player more than d4, d5. And also I have a lot of experience with the Benko Gambit. It's an opening that I learned about 10 years ago now, and I've kind of played it off and on, so I just wanted to give it a try in this game. And this is basically a must-win game for me. If I want to have chances at a GM Norm, I got to win a game like this against a player I outrate by 250 points, and even if that weren't the case, I would still be going for the victory 100%. So he accepted the pawn. He took on b5, and I played a6, and he took this pawn too. So the idea of this opening, if I can summarize it briefly, is that black is willing to sacrifice a pawn on the queen side to open lines. So this pawn will be regained. Black will soon take it with the bishop, and we've cleared out the A and the B files, and that is a source of long-term compensation for black. Black does not play the Benko Gambit to win immediately. It's not an opening where you're looking to knock white out in the first like 20 moves. It's more of like a long-term positional opening, actually. And it kind of sounds funny to talk about a gambit in terms of positional themes, but in my opinion, the Benko Gambit is absolutely a positional gambit because you do get this pressure against the A and the B files, and black's remaining pawns, if you all notice, are connected. So one thing I found in the Benko is that black often enjoys a very harmonious pawn structure and can play against white's weaknesses. So after this, I played g6. This is just a move order finesse. I try to get the bishop on the diagonal right away. You can also take on a6, but some people believe that bishop takes a6 allows b3, whereby white can try to set up a counter fianchetto. Whereas if you play this g6 move order, should they play b3 and then bishop g7, bishop b2, black retains the option of going knight takes a6, which could be more active than bishop takes a6. This knight might even come into b4 and try to attack d5. So I've never actually had someone do this queenside fianchetto, but g6 is the accepted move order these days. So white played knight c3, so Chris just develops, and here I did take on a6. And there are many ways white can play this. I won't get into the theory now, but he decided to play one of the most critical lines, so he played e4, supported by the knight. Notice I cannot take that pawn. I took the bishop on f1. Now in playing e4, white does have to wreck their kingside castling privilege, so they'll no longer be able to do that. After king takes f1, I played d6, just making sure that e5 is not able to be played. Also creates a square for a knight to come to d7. He played knight f3. I played bishop g7. He played g3. I played castles. And he played king g2. So you can see that white is kind of castling by hand here. They're tucking their king away, and they're also preparing for the rook to come over to e1. So this is all theory. This is all well known to theory. And now I put a little twist on a line that I've played before. So this line is actually held in very high regard for white. Chris had been using a little bit of time up to this point, but I got the feeling that he was not out of book yet. This is a well-known line. And the most common move by far for black in this position is knight bd7. Just getting the remaining minor piece into the game, and also holding up the e5 move. A lot of times white will be looking to break with pawn to e5, so we have another piece on that square now. However, after knight bd7, there's this move. It is a4, move 12, a4, that has been giving black a lot of headaches in recent years. This was identified a couple years back as a move that is potentially promising for white, just getting the queenside pawns going. Often white will play like knight b5 or rook a3 to follow, and slowly start creeping forward on this side of the board. And I had a feeling he might be booked up in that. He might know that a4 is the theoretical recommendation. So I put a little twist on my move order here and instead played queen b6. So no knight bd7, queen b6 instead. This is a common square for the queen in the Benko Gambit. It's fully in keeping with black's philosophy of pressuring down the A and the B lines. So my queen is now attacking b2. That's going to tie down this bishop, at least in the short term. And also I'm not declaring which piece I'll put on d7. And that probably gives you a hint about what I did coming up. So after queen b6, white played rook e1, just getting the rook into the action. Good move, I think. And here I played knight f to d7. So knight f to d7, unleashing the bishop along this diagonal. So as I mentioned, normally black puts this knight here. However, this knight on f6 when this knight is on d7 isn't optimally placed. Like often black will want to maneuver this knight anyways. They might go like knight g4 and try to get into e5, or sometimes they'll play knight e8 and try to go over to c7. So I figured, let's just play knight f d7, open the bishop, and I'm already putting a slight twist on the move order. Maybe I can take this concept even further. And it didn't seem that risky to play this way. You have to be careful when you're departing from known theory, especially in lines that are known to be pretty well established, but I felt like this was a pretty safe play, doing this knight f d7 maneuver. And my plan was to send this knight to a6, and then probably back to c7, or maybe into b4 if the circumstances were favorable for that. So one of the benefits of doing this was that I was starting to gain a lot of time on the clock. Not quite yet, but in the coming few moves, he really burns a lot of time. And I was ahead on time for the entirety of this game. So he played queen e2, and I had a quick look in the database after the game. This move has been played before, but during the game I thought this was actually a slight mistake. And the reason why I thought this was a mistake is that it weakens white's defenses of the d5 pawn slightly. The reason why he's playing queen e2, one of the main reasons, is to have the queen defend the b2 pawn laterally and thereby free up this bishop. So maybe white can send the bishop to f4 if they want to go for e5. That would be a common breakthrough. Or possibly they could send it to g5 to attack this pawn on e7, also a standard way of annoying black. So that's all well and good, but they do weaken this d5 pawn. And I thought, and I mentioned this to Chris when we were analyzing the game afterwards, I thought rook e2 was better, which is a great square for the rook because it defends laterally and it also might support the e-pawn, and it doesn't declare the queen yet. The queen might stay guarding d5. But he played queen e2, and here I played knight a6, so just bringing this piece into the game. And now white made kind of a committal decision. I think maybe this decision he made next was motivated by the desire to get a position like the theoretical line I was mentioning earlier. So he played a4, just striking out with this pawn. Now, if white is going to win in a Benko Gambit accepted position where they do take this extra pawn, usually it comes down to these queenside pawns, and white will eventually find a way to make use of them, specifically the a pawn, since this is a pass pawn, and its future rumbling down the a file is not bright at the moment, but if pieces get exchanged and the position begins to simplify, this pawn could become a force. All that being said, though, I think a4 is a little loose. They really weaken the b4 square and also b3 by playing that. And I think if I were white, I would try to prepare this move more. I might play something a little more conservative and look to venture a4 later. So I was actually anticipating moves like bishop f4 or bishop g5, continuing with the plan of getting the dark square bishop out. I think he might have been a little leery about the pressure down on b2 had he played something like that. Like I could maybe even, let's just say in the case of bishop f4, so there's no attack here yet, I could probably play rook fb8 and try to attack this b2 pawn. And note that white cannot play pawn b3 because the knight would hang on c3. I have a feeling white can make this line work. I was even thinking like maybe they can play rook b1. This allows bishop takes c3, but there's some strange stuff that can happen. I won't get into that line. But I think white should make an effort to try to get this bishop out at least, instead of just focusing on the a-pawn march. So a4, and here I got this rook over, so rook fb8. For black, the queen side is definitely the main area of operations in the Benko Gambit. You might sometimes switch to center or even king side play with pawn breaks like e6 or sometimes f5, but the queen side is usually where the action is going to take place. So you see I have both my rooks positioned to act as a buffer against these pawns advancing, and hopefully for black, pressure those pawns as well. And in playing rook fb8, we tie this bishop down further because should it leave, then b2 might fall, and so might the c3 knight in that case. So rook fb8, and here white played knight d2. Interesting move. He's trying to reposition this knight, and specifically I think he has the c4 square in mind. He wants to bring the knight here where it blockades the c5 pawn and attacks my queen on b6. So knight d2, here I played knight c7, just bringing my knight back. It was very tempting to bring the knight into b4, which also threatens a fork on c2. But after, say, just knight c4, which has the queen defend this and also hits my queen, I actually thought my knight might get in the way. I was just talking about the play down the file, and I felt like the knight could be a hindrance to that play. So I all along, I kind of had in mind that c7 would be the better square, just kind of getting it out of the way. So that's why I played knight c7. And here, white played rook a3. This move does a couple things. It reinforces the knight on c3. Also, maybe rook b3 can be played. After my next move, though, the rook b3 idea never really can come to fruition. So I played queen a6. And earlier I was talking about the positional aspects of the Benko Gambit and how it's kind of a long-term opening where you're looking for long-term compensation. And this move, queen a6, offering a queen trade is a great example of that, because in most gambits, you're trying to keep material on the board. You sacrifice a pawn, and when you sacrifice, you're usually not looking to trade down into an endgame. So why am I offering a queen trade? Well, in offering the queen trade, I think it enhances my control over certain squares. I wanted to open up the rook to observe b4 and also just the b file in general. And I felt like if I got the queens off, I would have a better chance of invading some of the weak squares that white has. So for instance, like say the queens get traded, say I take with the rook, like now the d3 square is kind of weak. Maybe that's even a reason to take with the knight on a6 instead of the rook. And I can try to go knight b4 and try to come into d3, maybe even c2. So certain squares become weakened. And also my presence with the rooks, I think, becomes even more felt when the black queen is not in the way on like b6 or a6. And I can afford to make this trade because there will still be plenty of material on board for me to try to outplay white. I wasn't worried about not having enough forces left to prove compensation for the pawn. So after queen a6, he thought for a long time and then eventually played f4, which I think is kind of an indication that white is struggling to find a plan, because f4 does gain some space, but it's never really possible for him to go e5 now because I have 1, 2, 3 pieces on that square, and white has already diverted the knight. When it was standing on f3, it might be able to support e5, but now on d2, probably not. So after f4, I also thought for a little while here, and I eventually took the queen on e2 with check. They're going to take back with a rook, which he played, because if knight takes, I have bishop takes b2. That pawn hangs. So after rook takes, here I played rook to b4. I had a debate about which move to play, kind of an internal debate going on, whether to play rook b4 or play bishop takes c3. And the bishop takes c3 move is a funny thing in the Benko because sometimes it's really strong to play that, but oftentimes it's just a mistake and you give up one of your best pieces. You see this bishop has so much influence down this diagonal. I'm really hesitant to part with it most of the time. The main reason you would play bishop takes c3 would be to specifically win one of the pawns. So with bishop takes c3, I'd be trying to win that a pawn. One point is that rook takes would run into rook takes a4, and black would just win the pawn back right away. And what often happens in these endgames, after black has won the pawn back, white's pawns are just loose. White has a little more space than black, but these pawns are loose, and black has this compact pawn structure that I alluded to earlier, which is a tremendous asset for black. And I've won endgames before with equal material in the Benko, specifically because this structure is free of weaknesses, whereas white has pawn weaknesses that they'll be tied down to for the rest of the game. So I saw a line here after bishop takes c3. If instead of rook takes, white would take with a pawn, which I'm sure Chris would have played had this arisen. And now this pawn is lacking one defender because we just took away the knight. So I could play knight b6, trying to attack it. And this rook can't really help out. It can't reach a2. So white would probably play a5. And then I saw here that I could play knight b5. However, this position I wasn't quite so sure about. I looked a few more moves into this, but I wasn't certain. And looking at it with the computer later, it says it's close to equal, maybe a tiny bit better for black. So I don't feel that bad about passing this up, but this was an interesting option to try to win one of these pawns back. But in the game, I felt like with him having burned so much time, it might be to my benefit to keep more pieces on the board and try to cash in later rather than right away and play bishop takes c3 at the earliest opportunity. So for that reason, I played that rook b4 move instead. And this is a good move to put pressure on e4 and a4. And now bishop takes c3 is actually a threat. So I was thinking of just eliminating that knight and then getting the a pawn next. Therefore, white played a5, so getting the a pawn away from the attack of the rook. And here, I'm going to show you my next move, and I want to see if you guys can figure out why I played that move. Okay, so the move I played here was king f8. And if you'd like to pause your recording and try to figure out why I played king f8, you can do so now. Okay, so this looks like a mysterious move, and it is to some extent, but there's a very concrete reason for it. In playing king f8, I defend this pawn on e7. With the king on g8, that pawn is undefended. And the point is, I would like to play pawn f5, and in doing so, attack this pawn, which is defending d5. So I'm looking to get this pawn break in, which destabilizes that pawn on d5. But if I do it right away, then white can take, opening the e-file, and after I take back, rook takes e7 will be the answer. So king f8 is a move to defend e7 in advance, so I can play f5 on the next move, or in the future. So that's the point behind it. And after the game, my opponent admitted that he underestimated king f8, or more accurately, he thought king f8 was just some sort of like long-term move, like maybe centralizing my king for the endgame, or maybe even going all the way over to the queen side. He didn't connect it to the fact that it's just played to defend e7. So after king f8, he played knight d to b1. I gotta say, and I'm looking at it from white's point of view right now, I gotta say this position is pretty tough for white. The engine actually doesn't think it's that bad. I think it even gives an edge to white right now. But be careful when you're using strict computer evaluations to get a feel for the position, because oftentimes the computers have no concept of what it's like to actually be in a certain position. I could easily set up several positions I could just whip up on the fly where the computer will say one thing, but when you look at the position, you'll probably give a completely different assessment than what the computer thinks. And I'm not talking about any like crazy positions. I'm just talking about normal positions you might get in the course of play, where the computer will say one side is better, but to a human, it looks like the other side is much more comfortable. And I think this position we have here is a decent example for that. I would be willing to bet most grandmasters would like to play black here, even if they knew the computer prefers white. Because there's just a greater sense of harmony in black's position. I have two rooks that are operating down good files. I have minor pieces that are kind of arrayed nicely. The strong bishop on g7 has a powerful impact on the diagonal. There's also numerous pawn weaknesses that I can attack. This rook on b4 is already attacking b2 and e4. The a5 pawn is kind of stranded. I have this clear plan of playing f5. And I just, frankly, don't really see what's so great about white's position here. They don't have a lot of things they can do, and they're pretty much just responding to my threats. And certainly after I get this f5 move in next, black is doing awesome. So knight db1, trying to reinforce the knight here and also maybe free up the bishop, this was a clear mistake. It overlooks my next move. So I get in f5, and white takes on f5. If they don't take on f5, I'll take on e4. So this pawn is going to be exchanged no matter what. I took back. And this is a nice exchange to make because now the d5 pawn can only be defended by white's pieces. It can no longer be defended by a pawn. So I've deprived it of its sole pawn defender. Here white played b3. So just making a single pawn advance. I think the purpose of this move was to try to swing this rook over to the a file and maybe back up the a pawn. But you can see that white's pieces are kind of clumsy. And b3, the pawn is just as worse off on that square as it was on b2. It's still a target for my rook. And here I played rook a b8. I like this maneuver that I did next. And in playing rook a b8, I attack b3 a second time. And white cannot play knight d2 now because their pawn is no longer defending the knight, so I would just have bishop take c3. And I think rook b2 is also a very bad idea. Not only does it look optically pretty cringy, but it also allows knight b5, attacking the rook and also hitting the knight twice. And if knight takes knight, we can just go take that rook behind it, and black's going to win material. So everything is coming together really nicely for black at this stage, and the threats are building by the move. So after rook a b8, white played a6. The point of this move is that if I take on b3, white sneaks in a7, and my rook is overloaded. It's trying to defend the rook on b3, and it's also trying to defend the pawn from advancing and promoting. So I would lose material here. I saw this a6 move, though, and I had my response in mind already, so after a6, I actually just brought the rook right back to a8. And even though I've wasted two moves doing rook b8 and then rook right back to a8, I've enticed this pawn forward where it will be easier to recapture. And bear in mind, I'm still down a pawn throughout all of this. Like, at no point, as I've been talking about black's glorious position, have I ever actually got the pawn back. But I'm trying to do so now with this rook maneuver. So I'm attacking the a6 pawn twice, so he pushed it, a7, and here I just played rook b7. Pretty straightforward move, just looking to capture. White played rook a2, but now that I've diverted these rooks, I can switch back to attacking d5. And this is white's big problem in this endgame, or queenless middle game, if you prefer that term, is the fact that they can't really defend both of these pawns as much as they would like to. So now I played knight b6. The knight wasn't doing anything on d7. I was already attacking d5 once, but with white's knight defended, which is backed up by the other knight, this knight alone is not going to win this pawn, and I do want to win that pawn outright. If I could win that pawn outright, then my d-pawn doesn't have an opponent here. And I have just a nice pawn chain in the center. So this is the plan. Either d5 or a7, hopefully even both. So I played knight b6, and I thought white might play rook d2, just swinging the rook back and trying to defend this pawn, but I would just take on a7 then, and probably I'm going to win. Or maybe that's a little strong. I'm much better from this position. If I can get equal material and white still has these pawn weaknesses, then black's definitely better. But I thought they would want to defend d5 because that seemed like the more valuable pawn to me. Instead, though, white decided to just let me have this pawn. So they played bishop d2, just agreeing to let me take it, which I did. I played knight b takes d5. They took. I took back. And he was very low on time at this point. less than 5 minutes. I had about 35, I want to say. 35 to 30, something like that. And he played h3. It's just very difficult to figure out what to do for white. It's equal material now, but the a7 pawn is totally blockaded by the rook. This pawn is definitely a liability. It's not an asset in any sense. White can't even really give it up favorably. It just ties down their rooks. So I think this position is just lost for white. The computer will find some way to put up a defense for white, at least in the short run, but I think given reasonable play, black should win this. So he played h3, maybe trying to advance g4. He figures things aren't going so well on the queen side, so maybe we can shift focus. And I just decided to prevent that. Yeah, this move is a little mean, but chess is a mean game. So in playing h5, I'm just trying to stop white from advancing g4. And I think this move kind of highlights how dominant black is in this position. The fact that I can slow down and play that move. And white just doesn't have much to do. This knight is stuck, by the way. It can't go to c3 because my knight and my bishop are attacking that square.